On November 23, 1985, 98 people boarded what they thought was a routine flight from Athens to Cairo. Within minutes, they became hostages in a nightmare at 34,000 feet. But the three terrorists who hijacked EgyptAir Flight 648 would kill only a handful of passengers. The real massacre came from an unexpected source, the men who came to rescue them. This is the story of the worst airplane hostage rescue in history. November 23, 1985, Thanksgiving weekend. While Americans carved turkeys and counted blessings, a 30-year-old teacher from Texas named Jackie Flug was boarding EgyptAir Flight 648 at Athens International Airport. She had no idea she was about to become part of one of the deadliest hijackings in aviation history. Jackie was one of 92 passengers, along with 6 crew members settling into their seats on the Boeing 737 bound for Cairo. Among them were families returning home, tourists ending their Greek holiday, and hidden among the crowd, 3 men with a deadly mission. At exactly 8 p.m., the aircraft lifted off the runway. Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA played through Jackie's Walkman as Athens disappeared below. Everything seemed normal, but Jackie had noticed something strange during boarding. 2 well-dressed men who looked extremely nervous. They fidgeted constantly, repeatedly checked their surroundings, and one kept going to the bathroom and back. When a flight attendant found an unattended briefcase, one of them yelled aggressively to leave it alone. Jackie dismissed it. She was wrong too. 10 minutes after takeoff, at 8:10 p.m., as the Boeing reached its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet, those nervous men made their move. Along with a third accomplice, they stood up, brandished guns and grenades, and seized control of the aircraft. The passengers' routine flight to Cairo had just become a death trap. The 3 hijackers were members of the Abu Nidal organization, at the time the most feared terrorist group on the planet. Their leader was Salem Chakore. His lieutenants were Omar Rezak and Busaid Nar al-Din Mohammed, and they had a very specific plan. Chakore immediately began collecting passports, walking down the aisle with cold calculation. He wasn't just checking documents, he was deciding who would live and who would die. The hijackers separated passengers by nationality. Americans, Israelis, Europeans, and Australians were forced to the front of the aircraft. Palestinians, Egyptians, and Greeks were sent to the rear. This selection process was chillingly deliberate. The hijackers were creating a hierarchy of targets. While Chakore processed passports, Omar Rezak stormed into the cockpit, forcing the pilots to change course. They wanted to fly to Libya, but there was a critical problem. The Boeing 737 didn't have enough fuel to make it. The pilots had no choice but to continue the conversation, buying time, hoping for a miracle. That miracle came from an unexpected source. As Chakore approached an Australian passenger named Tony Lyons, he spotted a camera in the man's hands. Convinced Lyons had photographed him, Chakore flew into a rage. He grabbed the camera, ripped out the film, and smashed it against the cabin wall. The violence was escalating, but Chakore's anger was about to cost him everything. He moved to the next passenger, a 26-year-old Egyptian man who appeared to be reaching for his passport. This was Method Mustafa Kamal, and he had a secret. He was an undercover air marshal from the Egyptian security service. And instead of a passport, his hand found something else, a loaded handgun. In a split second, Kamal drew his weapon and fired. The shot killed Chakore instantly. The hijacker leader dropped dead in the aisle. Chaos erupted. The other 2 hijackers opened fire on Kamal. Bullets flew through the pressurized cabin, 19 shots in total. Kamal was hit multiple times. 2 flight attendants were wounded in the crossfire. And then came the sound every pilot dreads, the sharp hiss of decompression. Multiple bullets had punctured the fuselage. The aircraft was bleeding air at 34,000 feet. Captain Hani Galal had seconds to react. As oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling and passengers screamed, he pushed the Boeing into an emergency descent, diving to 14,000 feet where people could breathe without supplemental oxygen. The damaged aircraft shuddered and groaned, but it held together. But now they had another problem. With fuel running low and the aircraft damaged, There was no way they could reach Libya. The hijackers demanded an immediate landing. Captain Galal radioed ahead to the nearest airport, Lucca Airport on the Mediterranean island of Malta. The Maltese government's response was immediate and uncompromising. Permission denied. Malta had a strict policy against allowing hijacked aircraft to land. They'd refused before, and they weren't about to change their stance now. As the Boeing approached the island, the Maltese authorities made a dramatic gesture. They switched off all the runway lights, plunging the airport into darkness. It was a desperate attempt to prevent the landing. But Captain Galal was a skilled pilot flying a damaged aircraft filled with terrified passengers and armed terrorists. He had no choice. Somehow, threading the needle in complete darkness, he landed the Boeing safely at Lucca Airport. The aircraft rolled to a stop on a remote section of tarmac. It was approximately 9:30 p.m. Maltese armed forces immediately surrounded the plane, and then began a 22-hour nightmare that would end in one of the most catastrophic rescue operations in history. Inside the aircraft, Omar Razak had assumed command after Chakor's death. When medics were allowed to board and confirmed that Chakor was dead, Razak exploded with rage. He dragged the wounded Air Marshal Kamal, who the hijackers thought was dead, to the aircraft door and shot him again at point-blank range. Miraculously, Kamal was still breathing. The doctor told Razak he was dead just to get him off the plane. Malta's Prime Minister, Carmenu Mifsud Bonnici, began negotiations. His position was clear: no fuel until all passengers were released. The hijackers countered with their own ultimatum. Razak's voice came over the radio, cold and clear. "I will kill one passenger every 15 minutes until you refuel this aircraft." At first, there was some progress. 32 Egyptian and Filipino passengers were released, along with 2 wounded flight attendants. Witnesses watched them stumble down the aircraft stairs, traumatized but alive. The Maltese authorities allowed food to be delivered. For a brief moment, it seemed like negotiation might work. But Omar Razak had no intention of backing down. When the 15-minute deadline passed without compliance, he made good on his threat. The first victim was Tamar Artzi, a 24-year-old Israeli woman. Razak had her hands bound behind her back with a necktie taken from a male passenger. He marched her to the aircraft door in full view of the Maltese authorities below. Then he raised a .38 caliber revolver to the back of her head and fired. Tamar tumbled down the metal stairs onto the tarmac. Incredibly, against all odds, she survived. 15 minutes later, Razak chose his second victim, Nitzan Mendelsohn, 23 years old, also Israeli. She realized what was happening and resisted, but Razak grabbed her by the hair, dragged her to the door, and executed her with a shot to the head. He threw her body down the stairs. Unlike Tamar, Nitzan would die a week later after being declared brain dead. The executions continued with mechanical precision. Scarlett Marie Rogenkamp, an American civilian employee of the U.S. Air Force, killed. Patrick Scott Baker, an American, shot but survived. And then came Jackie Flug, the teacher from Texas with Springsteen still somehow playing in her mind. Razak forced Jackie to the aircraft door. She had already said her silent goodbyes and prayed. She felt strangely calm, as if surrendering to a force beyond her control. Then came the explosion at the back of her head. Jackie felt the .38 caliber bullet strike her skull. A massive surge of electricity seemed to course through her head. But there was no pain, only pressure. Then she was tumbling, floating almost in slow motion down the metal stairs. When she stopped rolling, she was shocked to discover she was still conscious. 2 men dragged her body about 30 feet and threw her onto a metal bench in an ambulance. Jackie didn't know if they were hijackers or rescuers. She decided to take a risk. The men were astonished when the woman they thought was dead suddenly asked, "Are you the good guys or the bad guys?" What Jackie didn't know was that the hijackers had made their own bullets. Hers had a low powder charge. The bullet had shattered the back of her skull and lodged in her brain, but it hadn't killed her. Maltese neurosurgeon Dr. Lawrence Zrinzo would later perform emergency surgery, removing the bullet and bone fragments. Against all odds, Jackie Flug would survive. But back on the tarmac, the crisis was reaching its breaking point. By Sunday morning, November 24th, the standoff had lasted nearly 24 hours. 5 people had been shot, bodies lay on the runway, and 57 hostages remained trapped inside, with 2 heavily armed terrorists. The Egyptian government had been watching the crisis unfold, and they'd had enough of waiting. A C-130 Egyptian Air Force transport plane touched down in Malta, carrying approximately 25 members of Task Force 777, Egypt's elite counterterrorism unit. These commandos were trained alongside U.S. Delta Force. They were supposed to be the best of the best. The Maltese government, worried that the U.S. might take over the operation, welcomed the Egyptian team. The commandos studied the situation. They formulated a plan. The raid was scheduled for later that evening, but what happened next would turn a hijacking into a massacre. At approximately 8 p.m., a full 90 minutes earlier than planned and without warning, the Egyptian commandos launched their assault. Their approach was catastrophic from the start. Instead of a surgical strike, they placed 2 kilograms of Semtex plastic explosives underneath the rear fuselage to breach the cargo hold. According to Dr. Abella Medici, the head of Malta's forensic team, this was far more explosive power than necessary. When those charges detonated, everything went wrong at once. The massive explosion didn't just breach the cargo hold, it ignited a bomb the hijackers had apparently planted there. The combined blast created a fireball that melted the back of the aircraft. The interior plastic caught fire immediately. Black, toxic smoke filled the cabin in seconds. Remember, the hijackers had separated passengers by nationality. Egyptian and Palestinian passengers, including children, were seated at the rear, exactly where the explosion occurred. 52 people suffocated from the toxic fumes before the commandos even entered the aircraft. But the horror didn't stop there. As the commandos blasted open the passenger doors and emergency exits, they began firing indiscriminately into the smoke-filled cabin. They poured gunfire down the length of the aircraft without clear targets. Survivors later described commandos shouting conflicting orders in Arabic, shooting at anything that moved. Terrified passengers, trying to escape the fire and smoke, ran directly into the commandos' line of fire. 5 more passengers were shot dead by the rescuers. The operation wasn't a surgical hostage rescue. It was a chaotic, prolonged melee. One hijacker, Bu Said, was killed either in the initial explosion or the subsequent firefight. But Omar Rezak, the commander, proved more difficult to stop. When he emerged from the cockpit, a commando shot him in the chest. As he fell, Rezak threw a grenade. Captain Galal, the pilot who had saved the plane earlier, tried to attack Rezak with the cockpit's emergency axe. But in the smoke and confusion, Rezak escaped. Omar Rezak, bleeding from a chest wound and a punctured lung, did something audacious. He removed his hood and ammunition vest and disguised himself as an injured passenger. In the chaos, with commandos searching for hijackers and genuine victims screaming for help, Rezak simply walked off the aircraft and made his way to St. Luke's General Hospital. But the Egyptian commandos weren't fooled for long. They tracked him to the hospital and, holding doctors and medical staff at gunpoint, burst into the casualty ward searching for him. Rezak was captured, wounded but alive, the only hijacker to survive. The final death toll was staggering. Of the 87 people remaining on the aircraft when the raid began, 54 passengers were killed in the assault. 2 crew members died, 1 hijacker was killed. In total, approximately 60 people lost their lives. The rescue operation had killed more people than the terrorists themselves. The international response was immediate and damning. The Greek government blamed Egypt for the massacre. Questions flooded in from every direction. Why did the commandos use excessive explosives? Why did they arrive 90 minutes early? Why wasn't there better coordination? Independent investigations revealed that the rushed authorization from Cairo, combined with poor tactical planning and a lack of specialized aircraft assault training, had turned a rescue into a slaughter. Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak defended his forces, claiming they'd only fired 7 bullets and that the deaths were caused by the hijackers' grenades. But witness testimony, forensic evidence, and survivor accounts told a different story. The Times of Malta and international observers documented the truth. This was a catastrophic failure of epic proportions. Omar Rezak stood trial in Malta. On November 2, 1988, he pleaded guilty to 7 charges, including the murders of Nitzan Mendelsohn and Scarlett Rogenkamp. He was sentenced to the maximum 25 years in prison. But in February 1993, after serving just 7 years, he was released due to a general amnesty. The story should have ended there, but it didn't. The FBI had been watching. When Rezac fled to Nigeria in July 1993, agents were literally on his flight, monitoring his every move. In a brilliantly orchestrated operation, Nigerian authorities, working with U.S. intelligence, denied Rezac entry because he didn't have proper documents. They placed him on the first aircraft departing Nigeria, which happened to be a Gulfstream 4 leased by the U.S. government. It was an extraordinary rendition. FBI agents arrested him mid-flight, fingerprinted him, and flew him back to Washington, D.C. In July 1996, after a month-long trial, Omar Rezac was convicted of air piracy. His defense team claimed he suffered from PTSD and was insane. The jury didn't buy it. On October 7, 1996, U.S. District Judge Royce C. Lamberth sentenced Rezac to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He ordered Rezac to pay $264,000 in restitution to the victims' families. Omar Rezac showed no remorse. He stated the killings were in pursuit of Palestinian liberation. The court dismissed this as justification for killing. Today, Rezac remains in federal prison, serving his life sentence. As for Jackie Flug, the teacher who survived a bullet to the brain, her journey was far from over. She endured years of rehabilitation, fighting through brain injury, learning disabilities, PTSD, depression, epilepsy, and visual impairment. Her marriage ended in divorce, but Jackie refused to be defined by victimhood. She wrote a best-selling memoir, Miles to Go Before I Sleep, became a motivational speaker, and even met President Ronald Reagan, who helped arrange her medical expenses. In 2025, she published a second memoir and continues inspiring audiences worldwide. Until September 11, 2001, EgyptAir Flight 648 held the grim distinction of being the deadliest hijacking in aviation history, but its legacy endures for another reason. It remains the textbook example of how a rescue operation can become more deadly than the attack itself. 60 people died that November night in Malta, and the majority were killed not by terrorists, but by the men sent to save them.